The first thing I want to say is that academic writing is weird. I think we need to establish that up front. It's not the same. You could be good at writing poetry or writing an essay at school or comprehension or history essays, whatever. You may be good at different forms of literary practices. It doesn't mean that you're good at academic writing yet. Obviously, the more writing you do, no matter what form, space, place, it definitely helps you writing generally. There's no doubt about that. But I think it's a mistake to think of academic writing as just being about being good at language or good at writing. Rather, it's about kind of figuring out why academic writing looks the way it does. So that's my first point. If you find academic writing hard, there's nothing wrong with you, because no one is born being able to do academic writing. So that's my first point. The second point I want to make is that academic writing is not one thing. We often talk about academic literacy practices, but in fact, there aren't one set of literacy practices in the academy. You just need to open a philosophy journal article and compare it to a physics journal article to establish that there's no such thing as academic writing. There is different forms of writing in different disciplines, because those different disciplines have different histories and different value systems. So everything about the way in which the philosophy journal article looks emerges from the values, the norms, the structure of knowledge in that philosophy discipline. And everything about the way in which the physics journal article is structured, is written, is referenced, what tenses it uses, how many references it has, whether it's used as first person or not, all of that emerges from the structure of knowledge in that discipline. And so that's kind of why we often call it cracking a code, because I think as academics, we're pretty pathetic at making explicit to students how we write within our disciplines, because it's kept kind of mysterious, it's kept kind of weird. And as academics, we often talk about students writing as being about language. In other words, English language instruction, saying, oh, you're not good at language, or I need to correct your language. But you can be really, really good at the language in which you're writing and not necessarily good at academic writing, and vice versa. You can be pretty weak at English as a language and yet be a relatively good academic writer. So we do things weirdly in the academy, and we do things differently in different parts of the academy. And unfortunately, many of us teach as if the way we do things is normal or common sense or obvious. And it's not normal, it's peculiar and weird and comes from its history. And it's not common sense, and it's not clear. It takes time. And unfortunately, we're pretty bad at making the disciplinary norms explicit so that people can see them for what they are. We're inclined to always just teach the content without making clear the way in which that content was made through the structures and value of the discipline. I'm hoping some of this will become clearer when I demonstrate with some examples just now. What's important to note about this is, because it is a practice that emerges out of a very particular history and value system, it can be challenged. And I think we've got a really strong group of scholars around the world at the moment that are challenging some of our traditions that have been taken as sacrosanct and somehow absolutely crucial to the field. And people are saying, well, really, is it? Do you have to do it like that for it to be valuable philosophy or valuable physics? And I think it can be challenged, but you can't challenge that which you cannot overtly see and point to and articulate. And that's why I'm a big believer in teaching in ways that help students to crack the code, because being able to crack the code makes it easier for you to become an adept academic writer in your discipline. But it also makes it possible for you to challenge, because then the rules and the norms and the values and the emergent structures are more explicit, and you can say, I see what you do over there, I understand why you do it, and I'm not going to do it, and this is why I'm not going to do it. Now, of course, when we challenge, it's not about dismissing out of hand, and I think a lot of people want to throw out things that they haven't actually cracked the code of, and I don't blame them in many ways, because it's so flippin' mysterious and always held, held aloft. But in fact, when you crack the code, when you figure out why things are done the way they are, sometimes it helps you to say, okay, well, that makes sense. I can copy that way of doing things. I can take that on, and I'm happy to do so because it makes sense. Or alternatively, say, hang on, I see where that came from, and it is exclusionary or it is problematic in one way or another. So that is really all about cracking the code, and I need to crack on. Well, first of all, we've got to select what to read, and I'm going to come back to that at the end of this session. The second thing I want to suggest is that, data permitting, you should read the abstract before you download. I think it's very easy to just whiz through a database, to put in some key terms and just download. And you think you're doing work. You can convince yourself you're doing work. You're not doing work, you're just downloading. So I suggest that reading the abstract is really important because it helps you to make a decision about whether or not to download. Because downloading isn't reading. And then I want to make a point, which I'm not sure if you're all familiar with, and I'm sorry if I'm telling you something that's obvious, but when you do a search for anything, search through your library website. Don't just search through Google. Obviously, many of the databases your libraries have are very expensive databases. Your libraries spend a fortune to have them, and so you go through your library website to access those databases. But the database, Google Scholar, is available to the ordinary person in the public, and so a lot of people, a lot of students, I think, make the mistake of going to Google Scholar through just through their website. So what you see now is a little video of using Google Scholar. So let's hope this video shows. Can you type in if you can see this video, if it's working for you? So what you saw there, I'm going to pause it just to go back to the beginning, is if you just type in scholar.google.com, you'll get Google Scholar, same as anyone else in the world. And then you type in what you're looking for. I've searched for groundwater arsenic contamination in West Bengal. And there we go. I've got a whole lot of things. All those things with yellow circles around are available. Scholar, you will get some things available to you, but those red lines I've put to indicate that maybe what you wanted to read were these articles, neuropathy and arsenic toxicity, and you wanted to also read this other one, groundwater arsenic contamination in one of 107 arsenic-affected blocks. And those two are not available to the ordinary person on Google Scholar. However, if you, and I'm opening a new window, if you went into your library website, so here's the Rhodes University website, I click on library, and I'm going to go down there, and I'm going to click on Access Google Scholar. Now, because I'm off campus, you'll have to log in. This is the one for logging in at Rhodes. If you don't know how to log in from off campus, contact your librarian. So now if you see at the top, it doesn't just say, scholar.google.com, it says scholar.google.blah.ac.za at the end. So now I know that I'm on Google Scholar through the ac.za, through my library, which is now a big, big bonus, is that the ac.za websites have become data free over the lockdown. So the other reason is so that you can now get Google Scholar for free by going through your university library. So I'm going to do exactly the same search, groundwater arsenic contamination in West Bengal, but I'm now doing it through my library. And you see those two things there that were missing when I just went to Google Scholar. They are now there and available because I went through Google Scholar through my library website. So that's just the first thing to think about. Saving files in sensible places with useful names. So you've read your abstract, you've gone to Google Scholar through your library, you've read the abstract, you definitely want to download the article. What are you going to download it as? I'm just going to take this little picture here from my own hard drive, and you'll see there's a whole lot of articles I've saved. But what you may notice is that one of them is particularly ridiculously named. They often give weird names. So here, this one, yeah, Color 70. I mean, that doesn't help me at all. So what I always do is the moment I save something, which may give itself a weird name, is I save it with a proper name. And if I've already saved it with the wrong name, you just right-click and select rename and choose whatever system you use. I try to use the system of surname, year, and maybe a word or two about what the article is about. So that's something else to think about. So we haven't even started reading yet, but we're already starting to think about how to manage our reading in ways that are sensible. So let me ask you now, what are your usual first steps that you guys take when you are now reading an article? And I've once again put up a, to ask you, what do you do when you start reading a journal article? You can only choose one. So which one do you normally do? I'm just going to have a sip of my tea while you make your choices. Most of you who voted, 75 people voted, out of, I think there's 97 in the class. Most of you said you highlight your key phrases. Some read and then you cut and paste all the key quotes. A few of you make notes in the margin. Only 7 out of the 75 that voted said that you make a reading journal entry. Now, I'm going to go all evangelical preacher on you and try and convince you all in the next 60 to 90 seconds that the correct answer was make a reading journal entry. Academic writing is really about trying to take the knowledge of others and to see what it means for you and your study and your understanding and your intellectual growth. And that's very different from undergraduate level where, I mean, Bartholomew tells us that at undergraduate level, students are often trained, in my view mistakenly, but they're often trained to be knowledge tellers. So they've got to show off that they've done the reading, that they've understood the reading, and they've got to tell what they've read back to their lecturers through their assignments and exams. And Bartholomew says that there's a big identity shift when you go into postgraduate level, when you're no longer a knowledge teller, you're a knowledge creator. And so suddenly your job when you're reading is not to say, oh, I must memorize or paraphrase what this other dude has said. Your job is now to say, well, what is this dude saying? And do I care? And is it important? And does it make me think about my study in a certain way? And is it useful for me? And will it support what I want to say? So your relationship to your text changes fundamentally. And a reading journal, in my view, is one of the best ways to go about making that transition. And the way in which a reading journal works, and I'm not going to talk about it in much detail because I'll direct you to a little video about that later, but it really says sit and do a reading, a short reading. It could be a journal article or a chapter of a book, not a whole book, and just sit and just read that text. Don't try and no pens or pencils in your hand, just read it, sort of be respectful to the author and just say, well, what are you saying, dude? And read what that article says. Then set it aside so you don't have it with you, you don't have it open on your screen. And you put in a reading journal entry, and a reading journal, and they say they're the best. A reading journal is now a note to yourself, where you talk to yourself. What was the reading about? Those of you who were in Jeremy Baxter's session on developing experimental design the other day, he was talking about a statistics journal. So for him, he says every time he does a reading, he writes in his statistics journal, what statistical methods did that person use? Why? How? What can I learn from it? So he uses it like that. Others have like a research journal in which they constantly write themselves about what they're doing, what they need to be doing, what they're thinking, what they need to be reading. And then they also write an entry every single time they do a reading. And this is where I turn into the preacher. Believe me, have faith, follow this. If you do this, it will feel weird at first, but if after every reading you do, you write a note to yourself, scribbled, messy, it doesn't matter what language it's in, it doesn't matter what kind of good grammar or not it's in, it's for your eyes only, you write a letter to yourself or write an entry to yourself. What the heck have I just read? What was good? What was bad? What do I need to remember? What should I go back to? Reading more of, and so on and so forth. So, reading journals. You can go and highlight and take out your key points later. But if you do that, you are staying at the level of a knowledge teller. And you're just trying to say, how can I cut little bits from what I'm reading to stick into what I need to say so that I will sound cleverer or whatever. And that's not what you're really wanting to do. You're not wanting to summarize what someone else has said. They probably said it better than you. So you don't need to tell us what they've said. We can go and read them ourselves. What you need to do is saying, well, what have they said that'll help my thinking, or that'll help my project, or that will relate to what I'm doing? And a reading journal will help you to do that. Okay, now we're going to go on to the main part of this afternoon session, which is really getting onto the how do we read. Most times when we read, we're reading for meaning. And certainly when you're doing your reading journal exercise, you're reading for meaning, you're reading for a conversation with the text. What's the main thrust of the text? What is the content? You're reading for content. But I'm going to, this afternoon, in the next 20 minutes or so, suggest to you that as well as reading for content, you can also do what I sometimes call a forensic analysis of a journal article. So a forensic analysis is when you're doing the reading, you not reading only for the content, you're reading to make sense of how did this author structure it. It's almost like looking behind the curtain to see the hidden stuff backstage. I don't do it all the time. If I'm reading in an area that I'm very familiar with, I can actually read at both levels at the same time. I'm reading for meaning and I'm reading for structure. If I'm going into a new field or I'm trying to write a journal article for a new journal, then I'll do this forensic analysis of a few articles from that journal so that I can kind of crack the code of that particular journal. And for you, it's worth doing this with a couple of your core readings, with a couple of your prescribed readings, is having read it for meaning and written in your reading journal, come and read it again with these forensic analysis eyes on. Those of you who are into those CSI kind of programs, you know, where they're looking for the clues, they're literally taking the things apart to try and imagine the murder scene. Or you could, those of you who are accountants, you know, if you come and you're having a forensic audit, kind of looking for clues to piece together what has happened in terms of the finances. So let me ask you, what is an abstract for? Can I ask you to pop into the chat? What do you think an abstract is for? Journal articles, almost without exception, have abstracts. Sometimes chapters in books have abstracts as well, not always. So what is an abstract for? Right. Henry Muller says it is a synopsis of the study, which is very similar to LZ, an overview. It summarizes, Robin says. Okay, a slightly different idea from Yane, saying it's a tantalizing, you know, gives you an appetizer, just enough so you want to read it. I want to come back to that. It captures the reader, Kanagi is saying very similarly. A sales pitch, a teaser, captures the reader. Okay, so I've got almost two different kind of perspectives. The one is that it's a summary of the whole thing, and the other is that it's meant to tempt you to read further. I'm going to say that it's more the former than the latter. In other words, an abstract, yes, it should do the latter. It should be interesting and make me want to read the whole article. But that's not its main function. Its main function is actually to summarize everything in that article. It should tell you what is the big problem area, what is the specific topic that this article is looking at, what methods did they use if it's an empirical study, and then what were the main findings. So it should really tell you all. It's not like the blurb on the back of a novel that should tempt you to buy the novel, you know, that sort of ends ... and you've got to buy the novel and read the whole novel to find out who the murderer is. An abstract tells you who the murderer is. It tells you the whole story. It doesn't hide anything. John's giving us a nice sort of summary. It's introduction plus results and methods and conclusion. so it does need to do that. And that's quite important because, sad to say, many people don't read the whole article, partly because in many countries it's impossible to pay for these articles. I'm not going to get onto that topic, or I will use the entire 20 minutes I have left just talking about how ridiculous the entire academic publishing scam is. That's a topic for another day, and it is a topic that people are starting to get heated about, and changes are coming. But that's one of the reasons people only read the abstract. I'm sure you've had that experience of finding an article you want to read, you read the abstract, and if you click on the whole PDF, it suddenly wants $29.99 or some such. So an abstract should give you the full picture. If we have a look at this outline from Camlin and Thompson, I think it's quite useful, especially for those of you who are in this session, not just to be able to unpick articles that you're reading, which is very important, but also thinking about how to write a journal article yourself. So Camlin and Thompson suggest that an abstract is made up of these 4 steps. It locates, it focuses, it reports, and it argues. So they do say it's not always in this exact order, 1, 2, 3, 4. Sometimes it overlaps. And they, very importantly, they point out that what it looks like, what locate looks like, or what focus looks like will be very different in different disciplines. So this is not a nice, simple formula, but it does help you at least start to get the tools to make sense of an abstract. So locate. And locate is just sort of tell the reader, usually in the first sentence or two of the abstract, this is the big conversation that's happening. This article, these few pages, are connecting to this bigger topic, the bigger debate in the field. So it clearly shows what conversation it's participating in. It connects it with a bigger topic. That's locate. Then it will focus. Within that bigger topic, within the bigger debate, this is the particular problem, or the particular context, or the particular issue that this paper will hone in on. That's focus. Then it does the reporting things. This is what data was collected, this is how it was collected, this is how it was analyzed, and this is what we found. So that's the report, a description of the actual study, assuming it's an empirical study that's being reported. And then it argues, not necessarily and then, because it could be in a different order, but somewhere in the abstract, it makes the argument. Now the argument is, what do you show? What are you adding? What is your contribution? Because a journal article shouldn't just be, oh, because I've got to get a publication. A journal article is a contribution to the conversation. So in your abstract, it should make it clear not only what you did, but what is the position that you're trying to convince your reader of. And when you are the reader, you would be looking at it and thinking, well, what is it they're trying to convince me of? What is it that I'm meant to learn from this article? Rita asks, is this abstract look like this for all disciplines? It may not look like this for all disciplines. Camlin and Thompson actually give some really nice examples of slightly different ways in which the disciplines work. But I think it's quite a nice beginning formula, and I'll show you an example now. Let's have a look. So I did that search for groundwater arsenic contamination. This time I found an article from groundwater arsenic contamination through China. So I'm going to look at that abstract in a moment. I also looked at this one, which is about higher education in Kenya, and assessment of current responses to the imperative of widening access. And then I looked at a very topical one in a law journal on international law on pandemic response, a first stock taking in light of the coronavirus crisis. So I'm going to look at these 3 articles. I'm going to put them up and I'm going to ask you to have a look at them. Now, if you have a journal article that you would like to, instead of looking at the ones that we're looking at, if you would like to open it for yourself now, go ahead and navigate your way through to whatever article you're looking at, and see if you can see whether the article does these things. It might not be 1, 2, 3, 4. One sentence might do a little bit of 3 and a little bit of 2, but overall, does the abstract locate the article within a bigger conversation, focus it to a specific part of the conversation or a specific context, report on what the study did, and argue, give something to the reader of a lesson take-home message. So the groundwater arsenic contamination throughout China. Arsenic contaminated groundwater used for drinking in China is a health threat that was first recognized in the 1960s. However, because of the sheer size of the country, millions of groundwater wells remain to be tested in order to determine the magnitude of the problem. So there we go. We've got a first sentence, very big, locating a big problem. Second sentence, focusing down, that needs to be tested, the need for groundwater wells to be tested. Then moving on, we developed a statistical risk model, blah, blah, blah. We did this, we did that, we did the next thing. Threshold of 10 micrograms per litre, the World Health Organization. So that's their reporting of what they did. And then they make an argument. The key finding, first of all, we estimate that 19.6 million people are at risk of being affected by the consumption of arsenic-contaminated groundwater. Although the results must be confirmed with additional field measurements, our risk model identifies numerous arsenic-affected areas and highlights the potential magnitude of this health threat in China. The argument is this needs to be taken seriously. We've got the data. We can show you. It's a big issue. So it did indeed locate, focus, report, and argue. There's an education journal article from Kenya. Higher education in Kenya, an assessment of current responses to the imperative of widening access. Higher education is a key factor in a nation's effort to develop a highly skilled workforce for competing in the global economy. Right, big location, big concern, big conversation in the field. In this paper, current trends in accessibility, equity, participation, and financing of higher education in Kenya are examined. Okay, focusing down. This paper explores the challenges which need to be confronted and discusses the way forward for reforming higher education policies in Kenya to widen access and advance equity by suggesting a number of strategies. So it's reporting what it did. It's not an empirical study, it's a paper-based study, desktop study. It highlights the need for programs and policies focusing on improving access, blah, 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 blah. It argues this is what's needed. Last example, the coronavirus one. It's from a law journal. The coronavirus pandemic is currently raging throughout the world, right? Locates it in a big conversation. The ensuing crisis has acquired a multidimensional nature affecting all levels of society, still locating it. Measures adopted by domestic authorities have included a broad spectrum of restrictions, from general alerts to mandatory quarantines to isolation of individuals to blanket travel bans, cordoning of cities, in some cases countries. Many governments have declared a state of emergency, thereby assuming exceptional powers, focusing in on what governments have done and what powers governments are using. This dire crisis leads to our core questions. What are the relevant obligations, powers, and procedures under public international law? Have they been complied with? What role, if any, has international law via its institutions played so far? Now that's starting to report, because this again is a desktop study. It's looking only at papers, but it's reporting that these are the questions that they asked themselves. The World Health Organization, a specialized agency of the United Nations, is the international institution with a core mandate, blah, 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 blah. Against this backdrop, in order to address the core questions, this paper provides an overview of international health regulations in light of current issues and disputes, still reporting what it does. It then evaluates those issues and disputes, other regimes of international law, such as human rights, trade law, peace and security. So it does a comparison, still reporting. And then it says, the finding is the argument. Lastly, the paper offers conclusions by way of answers to the research questions. Now, I know they've had to write this in a hurry, so let's give them some slack. But I would say that last sentence is not a very strong sentence in the abstract, because it should actually say, last paper shows that the focus on international health regulations is using far greater exceptional power than has been used in similar cases in human rights, trade law, blah, 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 because that's actually the main finding. I hope you're all doing okay. I feel like I'm rabbiting on a bit, and I'm hoping it's useful. So really what I'm saying here is that, not to say that this is the formula that's always followed, not at all. But I do think it's worth, when you read an act, of course you're reading it to understand the content, but sometimes it's worth also reading it for the structure, to start saying, well, what are they trying to do here? And if you can crack that code, it helps you to read easier. And then, of course, when you're wanting to write articles, it makes it much easier to write. But even if you have no intention of writing an article, it helps you to kind of make sense of the reading of an article. Right, so having done that, having analyzed the abstract, the next thing I would normally do when I'm doing a forensic analysis, when I'm trying to make sense of the structure of an article, is I ask myself, what's the argument? Now, problem with the word argument. It's a word in English, and that's a problem because in English it means something very different to what it means in the academy. In English it means to be oppositional, confrontational, to fight. Whereas in the academy, argument looks very, very different in different disciplines. We build arguments differently in different disciplines, but all disciplines have arguments. And what we mean by arguments in the academy is to take a position, to make a contribution. So when we read, you need to ask yourself, what is the key argument in this thesis or chapter or article? Think of an academic text as a contribution, as a contribution to the conversation. And that, again, is a big jump from undergraduate to postgraduate. Because at undergraduate, you're expected to kind of, I shouldn't say this really, but you're expected to kind of parrot what other people have said. You're not expected to contribute something. You're not adding to the conversation. You're just turning around and saying, well, he said this, and she said this, and he said this. Whereas now, you are saying, well, dear reader, this is what you need to understand about this. And you need to believe me because he said it and she said it. But this is what I'm telling you. I'm the one telling you. And so you're making a contribution. So an argument is your contribution, the take-home message. So if you forgot everything else in that article, what was the main thing the author wanted you to remember? Figuring out the argument, I'd say, is a very important part of the forensic analysis of a journal article. An article says a whole lot. It's full of information, but you need to be able to identify what did the author want me as the reader to take as the main message. Now, of course, as it happens, you might read an article and the main message is not that relevant to you, but there's something in their methodology that was really useful, and you're going to quote that article to support what you do in your methodology. So the take-home message that the author gave is not necessarily the most important or significant thing in that article for you. It might be the way they defined a particular concept. That might be much more important than what their core argument was. But I do think as a reader, it's important that you learn to identify the argument, the take-home message, the contribution, the thesis statement, whatever you want to call it. You'll find that it's repeated in various ways, by the way, this argument. It'll often be stated in that in the abstract, and then it'll be stated again in the introduction, and then it's stated again in the conclusion, often using slightly different words and terminology. Sorry, I have to get up because my one dog is crying because the other dog has a blanket and he hasn't got a blanket. Right, jeepers creepers. I'm back with you. Let's move along. And it's built up from smaller arguments. That's how we make a big argument. A big argument, a thesis, of course, is a very big argument. And you may or may not know that, of course, the thesis is, the word thesis, if you look up the word thesis in an ordinary dictionary, it'll say a thesis is a dissertation that you submit for a master's or doctorate or whatever. But the second meaning of the word thesis is an argument. So that, I think, tells us, what is a thesis? A thesis is a big argument, but it's made up of lots of smaller arguments. And maybe argument is not a useful word. Maybe contribution is a better word. It's a contribution. It's saying, hello, conversation in the disciplinary field. This is what I have to say to you. This is what I have to add. That website at the bottom there, guys, is postgradenvironments.com. I would suggest that you go to that site and just do a little search for argument, and you'll find a whole lot of videos. Those are more for you as writers than as readers, but I think they can also help you as readers, which is our focus today. Then, of course, you can have a look at the structure of the whole article. I love Nicholas's addition here. Nicholas is saying theses, the Greek word for position. Fantastic. So that's exactly it. It's you taking a position and you're trying to write it to your reader, to explain it to them, to convince them that that's the position to take. So I think it's also useful now to look at the different headings. Some fields use loads and loads of headings, 1.1.1.2.a. Others don't. Others have long pages and pages of text. Humanities will have far fewer headings than the natural sciences. Why is that? It's not just tradition. It's also because of the nature of the knowledge, that the nature of knowledge in humanities is usually one that is conceptually built through language, versus
the natural sciences, where the knowledge is often kind of physically made in the field or the laboratory, reported in writing. The abstract we've already discussed, the introduction, luring the reader in, setting the scene, locating it within the problem, literature review, conceptual framework. Sometimes you might have both of those or either of those. Typically in the natural sciences you have a literature review which maps the most up-to-date discussions in the field on that topic and demonstrates the gap or the contribution that this article is going to make. In humanities and social sciences, you often have a conceptual framework instead, which outlines the core concepts and how those are used in the field in order to prepare the reader to make sense of the rest of the article. Then you have a methodology section. Again, in the humanities and social sciences, there's often some time spent within the methodology section or within a separate section to discuss the theoretical framework, which really tells the reader which theoretical lenses or approach will be used in the article. Could be, I don't know, critical realist or Bernsteinian or Marxist or what have you. In the natural sciences, the theory is often not explicitly articulated because it's a given and shared, and everyone agrees on what counts as truth and how knowledge should be made. And then there's the methods section of an empirical study, explaining what data was collected, how it was collected, and how it was analysed. And this needs to be expressed in a way that is convincing to the reader that the methods that were followed were appropriate and valid. Then you have a findings, results or results section and discussion section. In the natural sciences, those are often kept separate, with the idea that findings and results can be reported in an entirely objective way, and the discussion, though, allows for a small degree of interpretation which has to be justified, whereas in the humanities and social sciences, the findings and discussion are often merged into one section because the very nature of our knowledge is so subjective that it would be impossible to somehow separate out more objective findings and then more subjective discussion. So those are usually done together. And then conclusion, recommendation, which usually, again, gives the argument of the article, and in some fields it's very important to recommend what should be done. So why is it that we reference? So I'm asking you to complete the poll that you should see on your screens now and let me know why we reference. Okay, so most of you have said that we reference in order to provide evidence of our claims. Now, this was a bit of a trick question, this poll, because in fact it's true that we do reference to avoid plagiarism, to not cheat, to show what we've read. Those to some small extent do come into it. But I'd like to argue that avoiding plagiarism is really low down on the list of why we reference. And focusing on referencing to avoid plagiarism will actually prevent you from coming to grips with why it is the main reason why we reference, and that is because knowledge is built in the academy through a conversation with prior knowledge, and so we reference to provide evidence of our claims, to be able to say, this is what I'm saying, dear reader, and these other dudes, I'm building on what they've said, and they have been double-blind peer-reviewed and found to be credible in the disciplinary field. And I'm using their work to contribute to that and to build. So referencing takes a very different role if you understand it from this perspective. if we go back to this idea of argument and that a journal article generally gives you one argument, it's built up of multiple sub-arguments. Each section will kind of build an argument which collectively allows the author to make the main contribution, the take-home message of that argument. The sub-arguments are made up of chains of claims and evidence. So the author makes a claim, this is true, this is how people see things, or this is what is said in that document. And then you as a reader might go, oh really? Says who? And so there needs to be evidence for that claim. And that evidence is typically in the form of references. The author makes a claim and then uses a reference as evidence to substantiate that claim so that their reader will believe them. The other form of evidence will be your analysis of the data. So you make a claim that something happened in your study, and then you give us a data quote or a statistical analysis or a graph or something to show how your data allows you to make this claim. So arguments are made up of chains and chains of claims and evidence, claims and evidence, claims and evidence. And of course, it is true that there may be some claims that don't need evidence because those claims are so well established in the field that we all within this particular disciplinary field agree that X is Y. Or that A is true. And so you can simply make that claim. And that's why I say in the natural sciences, in the methods section, there's often very little referencing, if any, because the methods can simply be reported and everyone in the field would agree that those are appropriate methods and you don't need to give evidence to justify your use of those methods. Whereas in the humanities, and especially in the social sciences, the methods section will still include lots and lots of references because as the author is explaining the methods that they used, they're using the literature to justify, to give evidence for the claim that that is an appropriate method. And you'll also see that arrow that sometimes you'll make a claim later in the article or you'll see a claim later in the article you're reading and it will refer back to an earlier section of that article to say, you know, this is true as explained in the introduction to this article. The literature says this is true. So a very important exercise that I would really urge you all to do is to take one or two articles from your field, that from whatever your topic is, from your own research. Take a couple of articles that are very pertinent to your studies. I would suggest you do this with 2 or 3 articles and have 2 different color highlighters and go through that article, and every time you see the author of the article making a claim, highlight it in one color and then use the other color to highlight the evidence. It might be a reference in brackets, it might be an example from the data, but go through it with these 2 colored highlighters all the way through 1 or 2 articles, claim, evidence, claim, evidence, claim, evidence, so that you can see how it is that this author has been able to build their argument in a convincing way, so that you can start to see what counts as knowledge within your field and how is that knowledge constructed through writing in your field. So that 2 highlighters exercise. If we go back to the extracts of the articles and just have a quick look at those. Let's have a look at this paragraph from the law article about coronavirus. So it says, the Constitution of World Health Organization provides for the main decision-making procedures within the organization in comparison to other international organizations. There's a claim, but there's no evidence. And that's because in that field, that claim is so widely accepted, you don't need to give evidence for your reader to believe you. If we jump down a couple of sentences, we can read the sentence that says, the norm-creating powers rest in the organization's main body, the World Health Assembly, which can enact them by a 2/3 majority of members present and voting. And there you can see a little footnote. And in this particular case, it's a legal journal. Law journals use footnotes for their referencing system. And there you'll follow the footnote to the bottom of the page to see on what basis is the author of this piece making that claim? On what basis should we believe them? You follow the footnote and you see on what basis. Typically in law journals, most of these footnotes would actually be references to precedents, to other to legal cases. But in this particular article, it's quite a lot of the references are also to literature, which shows you that in different fields, different things count as evidence. But you want to use evidence that is strong and powerful and makes your reader believe your claims. So as a reader, you're wanting to look at the references which are being used as evidence for the claims and to say, well, do I believe this? Is this evidence suitable? And does it make me believe it? If we move on to the next article, this is the one on the arsenic contamination in China. And again, we see a system of, in this case, it's actually endnotes, but you'll see numbers and brackets there. A lot of the claims made in this piece don't have references, don't have evidence, because they are claims to natural science methods that would be well established in the field. But every now and again, you can see in brackets there 21, 22, and you'd be able to follow those to see the references to check, is that evidence strong enough for the author to make this claim. You'll also see in the right-hand column where it says towards the end, the model uncertainty is predominantly low, figure S5. So there they are not using literature, they're using a figure from their own study to provide evidence for what they've claimed. They've claimed that the model uncertainty is low, and they give you a figure, an illustration from their data to support that claim. The final example comes from that Kenyan higher education article, and here we can have a look in the middle paragraph. Despite the establishment of a national task force on gender and education in 1995, a national gender and education policy was not introduced in Kenya until 2008. And then in brackets, how do I know that this author is telling me the truth? Republic of Kenya 2007. So I can go and read that policy and establish that claim that the author is making here is indeed appropriate, and they've given good evidence for it. If I jump forward a few sentences, I see a sentence that starts Odhiambo. Odhiambo, 2011b, argued that higher education institutions in Kenya are still male-dominated, etc. Bear in mind that the author of this article is also Odhiambo. So here he's referencing his own previous work. There's nothing wrong with that. His work as a researcher is building on his previous work. So referencing yourself shows how you're building on your previous work. And often a new piece of work is indeed needs to reference what came before. So there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're trying to use a reference to make sure people take what you're saying seriously, then, saying, well, it's true because I said so last time is probably not that powerful. So you wouldn't want to do that all the time. The sentence before that says, see Unterholter and North 2011. So they're making sure, the author Odhiambo is making sure that the claims are not just based on his own say-so previously, but on the work of others. Okay, I'm way over time, so I'm now going to be wrapping up the final points. I said in the beginning that we'll come back to how to select what to read, so I want to quickly make a few comments about that. First and foremost, your required reading. If your supervisor or your lecturer has given you some core readings, some required readings, there's usually a very good reason for that. And so you need to work through those. You need to work through those for meaning and keep your reading journal. But I would suggest that those would also be very good articles to do this forensic analysis of, to ask yourself questions around the structure, around the argument, around the claims and evidence. If you're not just doing your core readings, if you're having to choose your own readings, remember you are doing readings to build your own knowledge, to build your own thinking. And then if you become a writer, whether it's an assignment or a thesis or a journal article, you're wanting to use readings to be able to show how you're contributing to a conversation. You're wanting to show that you're aware of the main conversations and debates. And you're wanting to use those readings as evidence for what you are claiming. So you need to make sure you are reading credible texts. And that includes where's it published. If it's published on a website or university website or anything, it's nowhere near as strong and powerful as a piece of evidence than a journal article that's gone through peer review. And currency. It's really important that you use up-to-date readings, because you're wanting to use those to support what you're saying. And if all your articles are from 10 years back, people are going to say, yeah, but the conversation in the field has moved on. So you need to be up-to-date. Of course, there are some seminal texts, the big names that people continue to reference decades or even in some cases hundreds of years later. And you may well want to reference something from years ago because you feel it's been overlooked. And you can explicitly say to your reader, that this author was overlooked, often because of the colonial ways in which knowledge is distributed. So there's certainly nothing wrong with referencing a very old reading, but you need to do it mindfully. To reference a reading from 15 years ago to justify using focus groups is unacceptable because there's articles from last week that discuss the use of focus groups. So if you're referencing old texts, you should have very good reasons for doing so. It's really important to start noticing what the key sources are. As you're reading, notice who's been referenced time and time again. You probably need to go and read them. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but you need to read the big names in your field. Sometimes the heavy theorists are really hard to read, and I feel you've got to creep up on them. Rather than going straight to Bernstein or Bourdieu or whoever it is, I find it's really useful to go and read some other people's theses that have used that. PhD students and master's students are really good at translating complicated theory into more accessible ways, but bear in mind they might have got it wrong. But it's useful to start with those. Wikipedia is brilliant. I know we don't reference Wikipedia because it doesn't have that strong validity of double-blind peer-reviewed, but it is actually very useful space to go. If you come across a name time and time again, go and read that person's Wikipedia page. If you come across a concept time and time again, go and read the Wikipedia page for that concept. And then have conversations with people, talk to other people in the field, and watch videos. There's so many YouTube videos on most concepts that we use. But eventually, after you've crept around a concept or a theorist, you will have to go and read the original. Quoting secondhand is nowhere near as powerful as quoting the immediate text. It's really useful to start keeping concept maps and doing free writing. So as you notice a concept's coming up time and time again, if you've been keeping your reading journal, it's time after a while to set even your reading journal aside to do some free writing, put the name of that concept in the top and write non-stop for 7 minutes to see whether you are able to very easily and readily explain that concept to yourself in your rough writing. If you find that you can't do that very easily, if you find you're not quite sure about how to explain it, it means you haven't done enough reading and reading journal entries yet on that concept. So you need to go back to the reading. And then very, very final points. Reading and writing are social practices. They are not skills. They are not something that you have now got. You may have the skill of riding a bicycle, but you don't have the skill of academic reading or academic writing. It is a practice which tells us that it's not neutral and it's not common sense. It is value-laden and ideological and emerges from a particular history, but it also means it is a practice. So we've got to practice a practice to get good at it. If you are not yet very good at academic reading, if you are not yet very good at academic writing, you are someone who hasn't done enough academic reading and academic writing. And of course, even when you become fairly adept at academic reading and writing within a particular field, the moment you change topic or change fields, you'll find yourself going back again because you're now learning a slightly different disciplinary practice because, as I said, academic literacy, there's no such thing. There's rather the literacy practices of each and every discipline. And finally, for every reading, there must be a writing. Regardless of whether you're trying to write a journal article or just being a good scholar who will be doing your assignments, every time you read an article or read a chapter of a book, set yourself the task of writing for yourself about what it is that you've been reading and what it means for you and your study. Thank you so much for your time. Please email cpgs@lists.ru.ac.za if you want to get our mailing list every day to hear what we will be up to.